What's going on, guys? It's Tetrosphere, and I want to bring today another discussion type video, a bit different from what I usually do. I wanted to talk about my hand trap philosophy and why I think certain hand traps, like Bestials and Impulse, are significantly more powerful than the traditional one-for-one hand traps like Valor and Imperm. To be perfectly clear also, for the purposes of this video, I will not be comparing the lingering hand traps like Shifter and Droll and things of that nature, Lancia, just because I feel like they function and affect the game state in a completely different way than the hand traps we're talking about here. So strictly speaking of like the traditional like one-for-one hand traps, or the kind of like, we'll include Nibiru in this discussion as well. Strictly speaking about how these sort of hand traps compare to each other and why I like these 6 quite a bit more than these 3. And even in some cases, I'm not a huge fan of Ash Blossom. But we're also going to talk about how they play into some normal summons in the game. Particularly, a couple ones that are popular right now, like Sage and Dormouse, and even some historically powerful ones like Lotus and Snake Eye Ash. So to get right into like the gist of why I like these 6 and not particularly a big fan of these 3 here, is that these 3 are strictly poor in terms of raw card economy. So what I mean by that is if my opponent normal summons Snake Eye Ash and they trigger the effect to search, if I Valor, Imperm, or Ghost Mourner, or I guess in that case you can't Mourner, but just, they all function the same. If I Valor or Imperm, they keep the card, which means I now have 4 cards in my hand, and they have 5 cards between their hand and field. So strictly, I just negged. Now, the reason why Valor and Imperm were still really good in Snake Eye format was because you were trying to deny them like the virtual card economy of how much value this produced. So by denying them the normal summon effect, you were basically putting them on better have the extender in hand. And obviously at that time, that was quite good, and that was the way you needed to play into Snake Eye. But broadly speaking, in like the general sense of like deck construction and theory, the reason why I don't like this style of hand trapping is because you're basically denying yourself the agency of having control over the game states. Because if any of the other 4 cards in their hand are an extender or a way to play through that first hand trap, you essentially did this for absolutely no reason. And so if classically speaking of Ash, if they had like the Bonfire or the Witch, then you kind of just negged for no reason. So these cards have a place and sometimes are quite good. I'm not saying you should never play Imperm, never play Valor, never play Mourner. But when I'm building a deck and I'm thinking about the kinds of hand traps I want to play, normally I think about card economy and cards that trade at least neutral, if not positively, into my opponent's interactions. So sticking with Snake Eye Ash, even Ash Blossom is actually pretty poor into that interaction. But what I think can be a bit better in that regard is something like Ghost Ogre. Because Ghost Ogre, while I lose the card, I'm discarding, or rather I'm sending Ghost Ogre to grave to activate its effect, they also lose Snake Eye Ash. Now, that's not huge because they have a way to get Snake Eye Ash back, but now it's not so easy for them to use Ash's effect to tag out and summon Oak from deck or Flamberge from deck. Now when they search Poplar, Poplar is going to grab Temple, and Poplar might actually have to grab OSS depending on their hand in order for them to keep playing. Temple might not be enough because Poplar does not have the tag out effect, and they've already used their normal summon, so if they opened Oak as well, they can't normal the Oak. So the only other option is, like before OSS was banned, something like Black Witch. So even though Ogre doesn't deny the search, they lose the body. And because you allowed the search, it's still kind of a neg. It's still 5-on-4. So Ogre isn't like phenomenal here, but I think Ogre is a bit better just because it at least removes the Ash from the field. It's in any case, it's a neg 1, but I think this is a stronger neg 1. And something that this is a bit more obvious into, I don't have any Ryzeal cards, so I don't have the card to actually show that example, but in the Ryzeal normal summons, or even their inherent special summon effects, Negation is quite poor because, as we all know, again, they keep the body, and Ryzeal has so many extenders, they can easily create their duo drive or their detonator through a hand trap because they just need to have one more name or even a bonfire or a 7th Tachyon or a 7th Ascension in hand. So let's move on to Samsara D Lotus. Once again, they normal summon Samsara D Lotus. Now, typically you wouldn't Valor or Imperm, but because it's they just get it back. So classically, you would consider that a bad hand trap interaction anyway. But I mentioned earlier that even to Snake Eye Ash, I think Ash Blossom is quite poor because once again, they keep the body. In the case of Lotus, because it tributes for cost to special from deck, I think Ash Blossom is quite good. Ash Blossom, they lost the card, so they went neg. You neg on the Ash Blossom, so to speak, but you do deny them their special summon, so now it's 4 cards on 4 cards. So that's a situation where Ash Blossom was quite good as a hand trap, in my opinion. A bit more comparable to what Ogre does. Similarly with something like Sage of Eyes of Blue, these hand traps aren't necessarily great. Dormouse, again, these hand traps aren't necessarily great. I would think into something like Dormouse, even Ogre is quite a bit better. So I basically explained here why I think Valor and Imperm are not necessarily great hand traps, but why do I think Impulse, Bell, situationally Ash are good hand traps. The cards that Bell, Ash, Impulse, Ogre, etc. interact with are cards that can leave the field once their effects fail to resolve. So that's why like Ash is quite good card economy against Branded Fusion, because Branded Fusion also leaves the field. So you Ash, you're down to 4 cards. Their Branded Fusion goes to grave, they're down to 4 cards. Same thing with something like Bell, right? They might activate like, which is it, Ostinato? They might activate Ostinato. You can Bell that. Ostinato goes to grave. Dominus Impulse with something like Mitsurugi Ritual or, any kind of spell like first movement solo, anything like that. Also Branded Fusion. Impulse interacts similarly to Ash with those spell cards that would special summon. Ogre with any like continuous spell or trap that gets the play started, especially effective into cards like Chule. Ogre, I think, is inherently a good hand trap in terms of card economy because it necessarily also removes the card that you're interacting with. The only time that's not great is like the aforementioned Snake Eye Ash, where you allow the search. But anytime the effect doesn't generate value for the opponent, Ogre is phenomenal. So I have these Bystials down here, and I haven't quite talked about these yet. I think that Bystials, in terms of card economy, are the most powerful hand traps designed in the game currently, because unlike everything else here except Nibiru, you keep the card. So whatever I Bystial, not only am I denying my opponent some kind of interaction, but the Bystial stays on the field, and is obviously, of course, in the case of Magnemite as well, Magnemite even pluses further by searching one of these in the end phase. The only exception, or if you want to call it an exception, the only caveat to this is necessarily the thing you're denying your opponent is in the graveyard. So it might not be tremendous in terms of card economy in the sense that your opponent isn't like negging on the play, but you're denying them some kind of plus play, and you yourself are keeping the card, which I think makes these very unique compared to these other hand traps. And then in the case of Nibiru, even though Nibiru sometimes is really mediocre because sometimes the decks just have no problem extending past it or setting up a way to negate the Nibiru before it's live, Nibiru is, in terms of card economy, potentially phenomenal. Because you could remove, in theory, 6 monsters from your opponent's side of the field and give them a token. So in the best case scenario, your opponent is going neg 5. But typically, on average, let's say you're tributing 3 monsters, so neg 2 on your opponent's side. You keep the Nibiru, so you did not neg. That is a very positive interaction. And that's why in formats where Nibiru is viable, it's incredibly powerful, simply because of its card economy. So that, in a nutshell, is what I think about when I'm deciding what hand traps I like and how I want to construct my deck. Because if I'm just going to neg and put it on my opponent to have the extender, I would rather just not play these hand traps. At least not in formats where it feels like you need to play 20 hand traps. Because like obviously in like Snake Eye format, you were playing these because you had to. The denial of the normal summon effect was just so strong that if you didn't have a way to stop it on normal, they would go like +9. So you just had to deny it. But in formats like this, where it's not necessarily the end of the world if your opponent's normal summon resolves, I just flat out think that hand traps like this are better because of how they operate in terms of raw card economy. I really hope that this video helped, and I hope that you guys enjoy doing these sorts of, discussion and theory type videos. I enjoy talking about it. It's not necessarily videos I typically make, but if it's the kind of thing you guys like, I'm happy to share my thoughts on certain things like this. And I really appreciate you guys checking out. I will see you on the next one. Peace.